Imagine waking up one day with absolutely nothing in your hands. No tools, no fire, not even clothes. Just you, and a world full of animals that are stronger, faster, and far better armed than you'll ever be by nature alone. Now imagine your only way to survive that day is to somehow turn the ground beneath your feet into something sharp enough to cut through hide, wood, and bone. That's not a thought experiment. That's the exact situation our ancestors lived in for millions of years, until one of them picked up a rock, struck it against another, and quietly changed the direction of the entire human story. That single act, striking stone against stone, wasn't just a lucky accident. It was the beginning of the axe. And today we're going to trace exactly how that idea grew, from one crude spark into the tool that helped shape nearly everything that came after it. The very first version of this idea wasn't elegant. It wasn't even really a tool with a shape, not yet. Around 2.5 million years ago, some of our earliest ancestors discovered that if you strike one rock against another at just the right angle, a thin, sharp flake breaks away from the edge. That flake could slice through skin and hide far better than any human tooth or fingernail ever could. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but that single sharp edge unlocked an entire way of life. Suddenly, a carcass another predator had already killed and abandoned wasn't just meat you couldn't reach. It was meat you could cut into, strip down, and carry away. For the first time, our ancestors weren't limited by what their own bodies could tear apart. They'd started borrowing power from the world around them instead of waiting to evolve it. Around 1 million years later, that crude flake evolved into something genuinely remarkable: the hand axe. Not held with a handle, but shaped entirely by hand, chipped carefully on both sides until it formed a symmetrical, teardrop-shaped blade. Making one wasn't luck. Each strike had to be planned several strikes ahead, because removing the wrong flake could ruin the whole piece. Archaeologists who've tried to recreate them say it takes real practice, real patience, and a working understanding of how stone actually breaks. This wasn't trial and error anymore. This was a skill, taught, practiced, and passed down. Some researchers even argue that making one required a level of forward planning close to what we'd recognize in ourselves today, which quietly challenges the old idea that early humans were simply reacting to the moment rather than thinking ahead. And here's the part that genuinely deserves some awe. That exact design stayed remarkably consistent for well over 1 million years. It may be the single longest-lasting design humans have ever created. Here's something that surprises a lot of people. Despite the name, a hand axe had no handle at all. It was gripped directly in the palm, the sharp edge doing all the work, powered by nothing but the strength already in your arm. That's genuinely impressive for cutting hide, wood, or bone in small controlled amounts. But it had a hard ceiling. No matter how sharp the edge or how skilled the hands holding it, a bare stone blade could never deliver much force beyond what one arm could generate on its own. Try to imagine felling an actual tree that way. It's nearly unthinkable. For well over 1 million years, that ceiling simply was the ceiling. Human ingenuity had already solved the sharpness problem brilliantly. What it hadn't solved yet was leverage. The breakthrough, when it finally came, wasn't a sharper stone. It was a stick. At some point, someone realized that if you fixed a stone blade onto the end of a wooden handle, you weren't just adding length, you were adding leverage. The same arm, swinging the same amount of effort, could now deliver dramatically more force to a single point of impact. It's the same physics behind a wrench or a seesaw. Distance from the pivot multiplies power, almost like borrowing the reach of an entire tree branch and turning it into your own arm. It's a small addition that looks obvious in hindsight, but hindsight is cheap. Nobody handed them that insight. They had to notice it themselves alone, with nothing to compare it to. That single addition changed what was actually possible. Trees that were once simply immovable could now be felled. Forests could be cleared, not just walked through. And clearing land at scale is one of the quiet turning points that eventually made permanent settlements, and eventually farming, possible at all. A rock had already conquered sharpness. A stick was what finally handed it power. So how did ancient humans actually invent the axe? Not in a single flash of genius, but in two enormous leaps over roughly 2.5 million years. First, they learned to borrow sharpness from stone that their own bodies could never grow. Then eventually they learned to borrow reach and leverage from wood their own arms could never match. Every tool since has really just been a variation on that same idea, looking at the world and asking what strength it's willing to lend you. So the next time you pick up something as ordinary as a hammer or an axe leaning against a shed, you're holding the great-great-grandchild of an idea that took our ancestors well over 1 million years to fully work out. If you had woken up back then with nothing but a rock and a problem to solve, do you think you'd have figured out the same thing? Tell me honestly in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. If stories like this genuinely move you, subscribe. There's a lot more of this ancient world worth uncovering, and I'll see you in the next one.